Julian Vane was a sound archaeologist. His job was to take ancient, degraded recording formats, wax cylinders, wire recordings, and decaying magnetic tape, and use AI-driven software to scrub away the hiss of time. He lived for the silence between the notes. One Tuesday, a heavy, unmarked crate arrived at his studio in foggy London. Inside was a collection of glass discs, coated in a layer of dark, iridescent soot. There was no note, only a brass key with a tag that read, "The Black Box of 1924." Julian was intrigued. Glass discs were rare. He placed the first disc on his custom-built turntable. As the needle touched the soot, the speakers didn't emit music. They emitted the sound of breathing. It wasn't just one person. It was thousands. A rhythmic, tidal wave of inhales and exhales that filled the room. Julian adjusted his headphones, turning up the gain. H-H-H-H-H-H. S-S-S-S-S-S. Deep within the collective breathing, Julian heard a voice. It was faint, buried under 90 years of dust. "Julian," the voice whispered. Julian froze. He pulled his headphones off, his heart hammering. "Who's there?" The room was empty. The only sound was the hum of his computer fans. He put the headphones back on. The recording had changed. The thousands of breathers had stopped. Now, there was only one person breathing, and it sounded like they were standing exactly 1 inch behind his left ear. "It's so cold in the glass," Julian, the voice said. It was a woman's voice, melodic, cracked, and terrifyingly familiar. It sounded like his mother, who had been dead for 10 years. Julian's hand trembled as he reached for the stop button, but his mouse wouldn't move. The cursor was pinned to the center of the screen. On his monitor, the waveform of the audio wasn't a jagged line anymore. It was forming a shape, a pattern of peaks and valleys that looked like a human face screaming. Suddenly, the iridescent soot on a glass disc began to vibrate. It lifted off the surface of the record like iron filings, swirling into a small, dark cloud in the center of the studio. The cloud mimicked the rhythm of the breathing. H-H-H-H-H-H. S-S-S-S-S-S. Julian realized with a jolt of horror that the black box wasn't a recording of sounds. It was a storage device for souls. And by playing the disc, he hadn't just heard the breath. He had given a way out. Julian ripped the power cord from the wall. The studio should have plunged into silence, but the breathing continued. It wasn't coming from the speakers anymore. It was coming from the walls, the desk, and the very air he was inhaling. He stumbled to the bathroom, splashing cold water on his face. His skin felt tight, as if a layer of invisible film had settled over him. He looked in the mirror and opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out, at least not his sound. "The air is crowded, Julian," his mouth said. The voice was deep, ancient, and layered with the static of a century-old radio. Julian clutched his throat. He tried to say his own name, but his vocal cords felt like they were being played by a ghost. Every word he attempted was hijacked. The soot, the dark, iridescent dust from the glass disc, had entered his lungs. It was now coating his windpipe, acting as a biological speaker for the archive. He rushed back to his desk and grabbed a magnifying glass. He looked at the soot that had settled on his skin. Under the lens, the dust wasn't charcoal or carbon. They were microscopic, jagged shards of human bone. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The Black Box of 1924 was a project by a fringe scientist who believed that sound was matter. The scientist hadn't recorded voices. He had pulverized the speakers and turned their physical essence into vibrations, etched forever into glass. Julian's phone buzzed. It was a text from his landlord. "Is everything okay? The neighbors say they hear a crowd of people talking in your room." Julian tried to type a reply, but his fingers felt heavy. The soot was beneath his fingernails, vibrating. His phone screen began to flicker, the light pulsing in time with that rhythmic, tidal breathing. H-H-H-H-H-H. S-S-S-S-S-S. Suddenly, the dark cloud of dust in the room began to expand. It wasn't just swirling anymore. It was seeking out other, hollow spaces. It poured into his guitar, turning the wooden body into a moaning lung. It flowed into the ventilation shafts. turning the entire apartment building into a giant flute of human sorrow. "We are the unuttered," the voice vibrated from Julian's own chest. "We are the secrets that were breathed into the dark. You have opened the vault, Julian. Now, you must provide the wind." Julian felt a sharp pain in his chest. His own lungs were no longer moving on his command. He was being forced to breathe in a specific staccato pattern, a code. He was being used as a bellows to power the dead voices. He looked at the second glass disc in the crate. It was labeled, "The Conductor." If he didn't find a way to silence the first disc, the archive would consume his oxygen until his heart stopped, turning his own body into the next layer of soot. Julian's vision began to spark at the edges. Hyperventilation was setting in, but it wasn't his choice. His chest expanded until his ribs felt like they would snap, then collapsed with a violent hiss. He was a human accordion, played by a century of dead air. "I have to empty the room," Julian gasped between the forced breaths. He remembered an old piece of equipment in the corner of his studio, an industrial vacuum sealer used for preserving fragile master tapes. If he could create a localized vacuum, he might be able to suck the iridescent bone dust out of the air and back into a pressurized container. With shaking hands, Julian dragged the heavy vacuum unit to the center of the room. He grabbed a plastic specimen bag and taped it to the intake nozzle. As he flicked the switch, the machine let out a high-pitched whine. The dark cloud of soot reacted instantly. It didn't flee, it coiled. The dust formed into a long, serpentine shape that whipped around the room, smashing his frame degrees and knocking his expensive monitors to the floor. "Julian, listen to the gaps." The voice from his own throat whispered. The second glass disc, the conductor, began to spin on the turntable, even though the power was still cut. As it spun, the soot didn't go into the vacuum. Instead, it began to vibrate against the plastic bag, creating a sound like 1,000 needles scratching a chalkboard. The sound resolved into a melody. A lullaby. Julian froze. He recognized that tune. It was a song his father used to hum in the basement, a basement Julian was never allowed to enter. Suddenly, the audio archive didn't just play voices, it played memories. The air in the studio grew thick and cold. Julian saw a shimmering, translucent image form in the dust. A man sitting at a workbench, meticulously grinding something into a fine powder. It was his father, Silas Vane. Silas wasn't just a hobbyist. In the memory, Julian saw Silas holding a glass disc, the very one currently spinning. "The soul is just a vibration," Julian, the image of his father said, his voice overlapping with the static of the archive. "If you record the final breath, you hold the person forever. I didn't lose your mother. I just archived her." Julian's heart stopped. The black box of 1924 wasn't a random delivery. It was his inheritance. His mother hadn't died of an illness. His father had processed her. The vacuum machine began to smoke. The soot was too dense, too heavy with the weight of souls. The plastic bag exploded, showering Julian in a fresh layer of stinging, iridescent shards. "You're not archiving me," Julian roared, his voice finally breaking through the ghost frequency. He grabbed the brass key. He realized the vacuum wouldn't work because the archive wasn't just in the air, it was in the keynote. To stop the breathing, he didn't need to remove the dust. He needed to change the pressure. He looked at the third disc in the crate. It was blacker than the others, absorbing all the light in the room. It was labeled, "The Exhale." The studio felt like the inside of a pressurized airplane cabin. Julian's ears popped painfully, and a thin trickle of blood began to run from his nose. The iridescent soot was no longer a cloud. It had become a thick, swirling fog that turned the walls of his studio into a blur of gray shadows. "The Exhale," Julian whispered, his fingers hovering over the third disc. He knew the physics of sound. If the first disc was the inhale, the pulling of souls into the glass, then the third disc was the release. But the sheer volume of breath stored in the archive was staggering. If he played it, the sudden release of 90 years of compressed atmospheric pressure would be like a bomb going off. "Do it, Julian," his father's voice hissed from the corners of the room. "Let her out. Let us all out." Julian looked at the waveform on his screen. It was no longer a face. It was a map of a storm. The pressure was building. If he didn't play the disc, his own lungs would eventually collapse under the weight of the air he was being forced to hold. He placed the exhale onto the turntable. As the needle touched the black surface, there was no sound at first, just a deep, sub-bass vibration that made the floorboards rattle. Then the air began to move, not in a breeze, but in a violent centrifugal force. Ho-ho! The sound was a collective scream of relief. Thousands of voices, suppressed for a century, rushed out of the glass at once. The windows of the studio shattered outward. The heavy soundproofing foam was ripped from the walls. Julian was thrown against his desk, the wind pinning him down. He saw them, translucent, wispy silhouettes of people from 1924, 1950, 1990. They were like smoke rings given human form, spiraling out of the studio and into the London night. Among the chaos, a single figure stayed behind. It was a woman with soft eyes and a face Julian had only seen in faded photographs. "Julian," she said. Her voice wasn't a recording anymore. It was clear. It was warm. "Mom." She reached out, her hand made of the shimmering soot. But as she touched his cheek, the exhale reached its peak. The pressure in the room flipped from high to low. A massive vacuum began to form in the center of the room, pulling everything back toward the turntable. The cycle, Julian realized. It's a loop. The archive didn't just want to release the souls. It wanted to refresh them. It was exhaling the old air to make room for something new. It was looking for a new master recording. The needle on the turntable began to glow red hot. The vacuum was pulling the air right out of Julian's throat. He watched as his mother's image began to be sucked back into the black disc, her face twisting in a silent plea for help. Julian grabbed the heavy brass key. He didn't use it to open the crate. He slammed the sharp edge of the key into the spinning black disc, trying to shatter the cycle before the vacuum took him to. The sound of the shattering disc wasn't a bang. It was a sudden, violent absence. Julian felt the world snap. 1 second, the air was a hurricane of screams and rushing wind. The next, it was as if someone had hit a cosmic mute button. He watched his heavy desk slam into the floor, but it made no sound. He saw his own mouth open in a shout, but his ears heard nothing, not even the vibration in his own skull. He scrambled to his feet, clutching his ears. He tapped his fingers against his chest. Silence. He picked up a shard of the broken glass disc and threw it against the wall. He saw it splinter into 1,000 pieces, but the impact was as quiet as a falling leaf in a vacuum. Julian stepped out of his studio and into the hallway of his apartment building. He saw his neighbor, Mrs. Gable, screaming at her dog. The dog was barking furiously, its chest heaving, its teeth bared, but the hallway was a tomb. He ran to the window and looked down at the London streets. The city was in a state of silent panic. Cars were swerving, crashing into one another, but there was no sound of rending metal or screeching tires. People were standing in the middle of the road, clutching their throats, their faces contorted in terror. "I didn't just break the disc," Julian whispered, though he couldn't hear his own words. "I broke the medium." He realized the black box had been a cosmic tuning fork. By shattering the exhale mid-cycle, Julian had created an anti-frequency. The souls he had released hadn't just flown away. They had taken the resonance of the world with them. The world wasn't deaf. The world had been stripped of its ability to vibrate. Julian stumbled back into his studio, his head spinning. In the center of the room, the iridescent soot, the bone dust, was no longer swirling. It had settled into a perfect, unmoving layer on every surface. But there was something new. On his computer monitor, which was still miraculously powered on, the audio software was flatlining. A single, horizontal line stretched across the screen. But as Julian watched, a small blip appeared. It wasn't a sound. It was a visual representation of a signal. Someone was trying to transmit from the silent side. Julian grabbed his headphones, but they were useless. He looked at the soot on his desk. He remembered an old trick from his studies, cymatics. If he could vibrate a surface at the right frequency, the dust would form geometric patterns. He grabbed a signal generator and a metal plate. He couldn't hear the frequency, but he could dial it in manually. He started at 20 hertz and began to climb. At 440 hertz, the soot on the plate began to move. It didn't form a circle or a square. It formed letters. "We have the vibration, Julian, but we need a conductor." The archive hadn't disappeared. It had migrated. It was no longer in the glass. It was in the background radiation of the universe. And without a way to channel it back into the physical world, the silence would eventually cause the molecular bonds of reality to vibrate apart. Then, Julian felt a cold pressure in his hand. He looked down at the brass key. The key was beginning to glow with a faint violet light. It wasn't just a key to a box. It was a tuning fork. The silence was becoming physical. Without the constant, microscopic vibration of sound, the air felt heavy and stagnant, like breathing through wet wool. Julian noticed that the colors of the world were starting to fade into a dull, monochromatic gray. He knew the science. Sound and light are both waves. If one stopped, the other would eventually follow. He looked at the brass key. It was vibrating so intensely in his hand that it blurred. It was seeking its parent frequency. Big Ben, Julian thought. The thought felt like a shout in his mind. The Great Bell of Westminster was one of the largest acoustic resonators in the world. If he could strike it using the brass key as a bridge, he might be able to create a sonic reset, a tone so pure and powerful it would shatter the anti-frequency and call the sound back from the void. He ran out of his apartment. The streets were a nightmare of silent motion. A bus had plowed into a storefront, and people were gathered around the wreckage, their mouths open in silent wails of grief. It looked like a film from the 1920s, played at a terrifying speed. Julian reached the Palace of Westminster. The security guards were distracted, trying to use radios that emitted nothing but visual static on their screens. He slipped through a side maintenance door, his heart hammering against his ribs in a rhythm he could no longer hear. He climbed the endless spiral staircase of the Elizabeth Tower. Each step felt like a mile. His lungs burned, but the archive soot inside him was acting as a strange fuel, keeping his muscles moving. He finally reached the belfry. There was Big Ben. The massive iron bell hung in the center of the dark chamber, cold and imposing. Julian approached the bell. He held up the brass key. The violet glow from the metal was now blinding, illuminating the dust motes in the air. He realized that the soot, the pulverized remains of the archive, had followed him here. It was coating the bell, turning the iron into a dark, iridescent mirror. He checked his watch. It was 11:59 p.m. "I have to strike it at the top of the hour," Julian whispered to the silence. But as he raised the key to strike, the shadows in the belfry began to cohere. The soot on the bell rippled, and a figure stepped out of the metal. It was his father, Silas, but he was no longer a man. He was a creature of pure, jagged waves, a frequency wraith. "Don't do it, Julian," the wraith signaled, the words appearing as ripples in the air. "The silence is peace. No more screaming, no more secrets. If you bring the sound back, you bring the pain back too." The wraith lunged, its hands made of discordant static. Julian dodged, his foot slipping on the edge of the high platform. Below him, the silent city of London waited like a patient grave. Julian realized the wraith wasn't just a ghost. It was the resistance of the archive. It wanted to keep the world muted so it could rule the stillness. He gripped the brass key tight. He didn't have a weapon, but he had a note. The Frequency Wraith, the distorted shadow of Julian Vane, didn't move like a human. It moved like a glitch in reality. One moment it was 10 feet away. The next, it was a blur of jagged lines right in Julian's face. Because there was no sound, Julian had to rely on his other senses to survive. He noticed that every time the wraith moved, it displaced the iridescent soot in the air, creating visible ripples. It was like looking at the world through a heat haze. The wraith swung a blade of solidified static at Julian's throat. Julian ducked, feeling a cold, prickly sensation as the anti-frequency passed through his hair. When the blade hit the stone pillar behind him, the rock didn't crack. It simply dissolved into gray powder. The archive is the only truth. Julian. The air rippled with the Wraith's message. Sound is just a mask that hides the rot. Let the world be still. Julian scrambled toward the center of the belfry, his eyes fixed on the massive iron hammer of Big Ben. He needed to hit that bell, but the Wraith was guarding it, its form expanding until it blocked the entire walkway. Julian looked at the brass key in his hand. It was vibrating so hard now that his palm was bleeding. He realized the key wasn't just a tuning fork, it was a magnet. He looked at the floor of the belfry, covered in the soot of 1,000 souls. He realized that the soot responded to his intent. Julian didn't run at the Wraith. Instead, he slammed the brass key into the floor. The vibration from the key sent a pulse through the soot. The dust rose up like a tidal wave, forming a wall of black, shimmering sand. For a split second, the Wraith was trapped, its jagged form struggling against the physical weight of the pulverized bone dust. Julian used that second. He lunged for the bell's hammer, but the Wraith was faster. It reached out a long, static-filled arm and grabbed Julian's ankle, yanking him backward. Julian fell, his chin slamming into the cold iron floor. His vision blurred. He looked at his watch. 11 hours, 59 minutes, and 55 seconds. 5 seconds. The Wraith loomed over him, its face a swirling vortex of gray noise. It raised both hands to crush Julian's chest. Julian didn't try to get up. He reached out with his last bit of strength and threw the vibrating brass key directly at the center of Big Ben. The key didn't just hit the bell. Because the key was the bridge, it acted as a lightning rod for all the stored energy Julian had been carrying in his lungs. The key made contact with the iron at exactly 12 hours. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The silence held. The Wraith's hands were inches from Julian's heart. Then the world screamed. It wasn't a bell ring. It was a sonic shockwave. A wall of pure, golden sound erupted from the bell, so powerful that it didn't just vibrate the air. It turned the air into a physical solid. The Wraith didn't just disappear, it was unmade. The sound wave hit the static creature and shattered it into a billion harmless frequencies. Julian was blown backward, his back hitting the stone wall. His ears didn't just pop, they felt like they had been filled with liquid fire. And then, the sound returned to London. Boom! The first chime of midnight echoed across the Thames. Below, Julian heard the sudden, glorious chaos of the city. The screech of brakes, the roar of the river, the screams of people finally hearing their own voices again. But as the second chime rang out, Julian realized something was wrong. The sound was back, but it was different. He looked at his hands. They were translucent. The bell hadn't just reset the world. It had started a new recording, and Julian was no longer the listener. As the third chime of Big Ben echoed through the fog, Julian pulled himself to the edge of the belfry. He looked down at the streets of London, expecting to see people rejoicing. Instead, he saw something far more chilling. The chaos had stopped, but it hadn't been replaced by normal life. Thousands of people in the square below were standing perfectly still. Then, as the fourth chime rang, they all moved their right feet forward in perfect unison. Thump! A single, massive footstep shook the ground. Julian watched in horror as a woman tripped. Before she could hit the pavement, the people around her caught her, their movements mechanical and fluid, moving as if they were all limbs of the same giant organism. They weren't just hearing the sound, they were obeying it. The master tone, Julian whispered. His voice sounded strange. It was layered with the voices of 1,000 others. He looked at a nearby television screen in a shop window across the street. A news anchor was on the air. She wasn't reporting the news. She was humming. It was a low, resonant frequency that matched the hum of the city's power grid. Behind her, every person in the studio was humming the exact same note. Julian realized what he had done. By using the archive soot to coat the bell, he hadn't just brought sound back. He had turned the world into a closed loop. The souls he released hadn't left. They had installed themselves into the living. The archive was no longer a box of glass discs. It was a biological network. The choir is ready. Julian, a voice resonated in his mind. It wasn't his father this time. It was the collective consciousness of every soul ever recorded in the black box. Julian felt his own jaw begin to ache. His muscles were twitching, trying to force him to join the hum. He looked at his hands again. They were fading faster now. Because he was the conductor who struck the bell, he was the only one not yet sync-linked, and the universe was trying to correct that error by erasing his individuality. Suddenly, the humming changed pitch. In the square below, the thousands of people turned their heads toward the Elizabeth Tower. They didn't have expressions of anger or joy. Their faces were blank, their eyes reflecting the violet glow that still pulsed from the top of the tower. They began to speak, not in sentences, but in a massive, overwhelming chant. Record, replay, erase. Record, replay, erase. The sound was so loud it began to crack the stone of the tower. The archive was trying to re-record the world. It wanted to turn every living moment into a static memory, so it could never be lost again. Julian looked at the great bell. It was glowing with a heat he could feel from 5 feet away. If the bell struck the 12th chime of midnight, the sync link would become permanent. The world would become a museum of living statues, trapped in a single, infinite song. He had to break the resonance. He had to introduce noise into a world of perfect signal. He looked at the broken shards of the glass discs scattered on the floor. He needed something that didn't vibrate at the master tone. He needed something broken. The tower groaned. The 10th chime of Big Ben vibrated through Julian's marrow, and with it came a wave of crushing conformity. Below, the city was a sea of gray-eyed puppets, their voices rising in a terrifying, mathematical harmony. They were no longer individuals. They were a giant hard drive, and the 12th chime would hit the save button. Julian felt his own mouth opening. His throat was tightening, forcing his vocal cords to align with the master tone. I am not a recording. He choked out. He realized that the archive's power was built on symmetry and purity. It was a perfect restoration, a clean signal with zero noise. To break a perfect signal, you don't need more volume. You need dissonance. You need a sound so ugly, so random, and so human that the system cannot calculate it. Julian looked at the massive iron hammer of the bell. It was moving back for the 11th strike. He didn't have a hammer. He didn't have a weapon. He only had the soot, the pulverized bone dust of his ancestors, and his own breath. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the sharpest shard of the shattered glass disc. It was jagged and irregular. He looked at the great bell, which was now vibrating with a frequency so high it was turning the air into liquid. If the world is a song, Julian whispered, then I am the scratch on the record. As the hammer swung toward the bell for the 11th time, Julian did the unthinkable. He didn't try to stop the hammer. Instead, he lunged forward and jammed the jagged glass shard between the hammer and the bell strike point. Then, he did something even more desperate. He leaned his head close to the iron and screamed. He didn't scream a note. He didn't scream a word. He let out a raw, guttural, sobbing sound. A sound born of grief for his mother, hatred for his father, and a sheer, messy terror of being alive. It was a sound filled with noise. Clang crack. The 11th chime didn't ring. It shrieked. The glass shards shattered into a billion pieces, and the noise of Julian's scream was amplified by the bell's massive resonator. The sound was hideous. It was off-key, distorted, and chaotic. The effect was instantaneous. In the square below, the thousands of people suddenly clutched their heads. The perfect sync link was shattered by the arrival of the dissonant note. The hum of the city's power grid short-circuited. Light bulbs exploded. The archive screamed through the mouths of the people. Error. Signal lost. Corruption detected. The violet glow on the bell began to flicker and turn a sickly, bruised purple. The frequency wraith of his father reappeared for a split second. Its face twisted in a silent howl as the dissonance tore its digital molecules apart. But the cost was high. The physical vibration of the wrong note was so violent that the Elizabeth Tower began to tilt. Dust and stone fell from the ceiling. Julian's own voice was gone, his vocal cords literally torn by the intensity of the scream. He collapsed to the floor, his ears bleeding, his vision fading. He looked at his watch. 11 hours, 59 minutes, and 59 seconds. The hammer was pulling back for the 12th chime. The final strike. If the bell rang clearly now, the system would reboot and the link would be restored. If it didn't ring at all, the archive would remain in the air forever, a silent ghost. Julian looked at the bell. It was cracked. A tiny hairline fracture had appeared where he had jammed the glass. One more push, Julian thought. He had no voice left, but he had the brass key. The hammer of Big Ben hung in the air like a guillotine blade. The world held its breath. Julian lay on the vibrating floor, his body feeling like a ghost of static. He could hear the archive trying to repair the crack in the bell, the iridescent soot crawling over the iron like metallic ants, trying to weld the fracture shut before the final strike. If that 12 o'clock chime rang true, the dissonance would be erased. The perfect loop would close, and Julian, along with the rest of London, would be nothing more than a permanent track on a dead man's record. Julian gripped the brass key. It was no longer glowing, it was freezing cold. He understood its final purpose now. It wasn't a key to a box, and it wasn't just a tuning fork. It was an earth. In electronics, to kill a signal, you must send it to the ground. With his last ounce of strength, Julian dragged himself to the base of the bell. He didn't look at the city below or the spiraling ghosts in the air. He looked at the crack he had made. As the hammer swung forward for the 12th time, Julian didn't scream. He didn't move. He simply reached out and jammed the brass key into the hairline fracture of the bell. And then he grabbed the iron with his bare hands. He became the bridge. Bong! The 12th chime hit, but the sound didn't travel outward. It traveled inward, through the key, through Julian's arms, and down into the very foundations of the Elizabeth Tower. The vibration was so intense that Julian's vision turned into white noise. He felt every soul in the archive, thousands of lives, thousands of screams, pass through his nervous system like a lightning strike. He was no longer a person. He was a conductor for a century of suppressed air. He felt his mother's voice one last time. It wasn't a recording. It was a warmth in his chest. Let go, Julian. Let's all go. Julian opened his grip on reality. He allowed the frequency to take him. The bell didn't ring, it shattered. The massive iron structure split down the middle, falling silent forever. The shockwave of the grounded note rippled through London, but instead of controlling the people, it acted as a giant delete command. The soot in the air turned to harmless gray ash, falling like snow over the Thames. The people in the square blinked, their eyes returning to their natural colors. The humming stopped. The news anchor sat down, confused, wondering why she had been standing on her desk. The archive was gone. 3 days later, the London newspapers called it the Great Midnight Tremor. Experts blamed a rare atmospheric phenomenon and a structural failure in the Elizabeth Tower. Big Ben was silenced, its internal mechanism destroyed by an unexplained acoustic event. Julian Vane was never found. In his workshop, the police found the unmarked crate and the broken glass discs. They found his expensive equipment, all fried by a massive power surge. But there was no sign of a struggle. However, if you go to the ruins of the belfry at exactly midnight, and if you press your ear against the cold iron of the broken bell, you won't hear a chime. You'll hear a faint, rhythmic sound. H-H-H-H-H-H. S-S-S-S-S-S. It's the sound of a man breathing. Just one man. He isn't trapped, and he isn't screaming. He is simply the one who keeps the silence. Julian Vane, the sound archaeologist, had finally found the perfect recording. The sound of a world that is allowed to be quiet.